Are you sure that a floor cannot also be a ceiling? Are you absolutely certain that you go up when you walk up a staircase? Hello, my name is Josiah-Daniel, and I would like to talk to you today about the work of MC Escher, and in particular, his famous print, Relativity. I would like to invite you now to take a look at this print. Think about how it interacts with light, space, time, and gravity. I first came into contact with Escher's work in February 2024 at the official MC Escher Museum in The Hague, the Netherlands. It was one of the last days of my holiday, and there were so many things that I wanted to do. So my dad came to me in the morning and said, "Hey, we're going to the MC Escher Museum." I kind of went, However, when I got there, I was utterly mesmerized by Escher's command of perspective, and I was fully absorbed studying Escher's prints. One of the prints that stood out to me quite early on in my visit was Bond of Union, which is on the right corner just there. It's formed by interconnected heads formed by a never-ending Rhine motif surrounded by balls resembling electrons, giving the impression of eternal infinity. This motif of forever runs throughout Escher's work, particularly in his later years, and is a key element of relativity. Let's talk a little bit more about MC Escher. So he was born on the 17th of June, 1898, in Leeuwarden in Friesland, the Netherlands. He went on to study architecture at college in 1919, but he was steered towards the art of printmaking by his teacher and mentor, Samuel Jessuren de Mesquita. And I think it's important for us to look at a comparison of the works of Escher and Mesquita in order to understand a bit more about how Mesquita influenced Escher's art practice. So on the left, we have a self-portrait of Mesquita, and we notice that he's used lines to frame the face, but he's actually left the face without any definition. We don't know anything about his own face. He's left it dark and drawn more attention to his eyes. However, Escher has used the techniques of lines, but his lines curve and bend and give us more information about his subject's features. And so we see that Escher has taken what Mesquita has taught him, and what he's done now is he's transformed it into his own art practice in order to show us the world how he sees it and how he wants us to view his subjects. A great way of how we see the world through Escher's eyes is in Tower of Babel. This was done 8 years after the previous portrait, and we really begin to see Escher's future genius in seminal form. This piece uses much skill in perspective and depth in order to create the majesty and grandeur contained in this image. Escher has given us the view of the Tower of Babel as though God is looking down on the workers just as their languages are confused. A common depiction of the Tower of Babel that we all know is the Great Tower of Babel by Peter Bruegel the Elder. It's an amazing painting, but what he's done is given us quite an almost 2D depiction of the tower. But we see that Escher has an unusual perspective on all of his subjects, and he wants to give it in a completely different way. He wants us to see the vast scale and the emotion contained in this moment. And so we've seen that Escher's art style consists of being very original and unique, and we're now going to look at more how he went on to explore infinity in his later period of art. So we have a comparison here between Bonifacio on the left, which was made in 1928, so the same year as the Tower of Babel, and then Up and Down on the right. It's important to notice that in Bonifacio, he's made the Italian town appear as if it is rising out of the sea on coral. In Up and Down, he's used these same skills with perspective, but it's completely different. He's used skills of distortion in order to create an image in the viewer's mind that doesn't exist in reality. He's moving from portraying landscapes to portraying mindscapes. Let's look at two important influences that led to the creation of relativity. On the left, we have an imaginary prison created by Giovanni Battista Piranesi. These fascinated and inspired Escher because of the fact that they had many stairs which winded around the image but went nowhere. And we notice that as a very key feature in relativity. On the right, we have the mathematician Sir Roger Penrose, and he really influenced Escher through his work on geometry. And actually, even interestingly, he went on to create the famous Penrose triangle based on the shape made by the three main staircases in Relativity. Let's take a look at the first example of work in this style of impossible constructions. Here we have Satire on Force Perspective. This is by William Hogarth in 1754. And we notice that the flag here is connected to two different buildings and yet goes behind trees on a hill separated from those buildings by a bridge. The man on top of the hill is lighting his pipe from a candle held by a woman in the top of a building separated from the hill also by that same bridge. And so what William Hogarth has done is he's shown us this weird creation that is actually meant to be an educational piece. It was meant to go in a pamphlet teaching art students how to correctly show perspective. And so what Escher has done, he's taken this art style, but he's created it into deep and meaningful art that is important in its own right. It's not just for educational purposes. We can enjoy it for its own merit. And so in this image, I think we see a more primitive example of Escher's work, and we begin to see a bit more of how Escher then moves on from this style and really develops it into his own way. And it all works with illusion. The blue card appears bigger, but if I swap them around, we notice that the pink card appears bigger. If I put them together, they're actually the same size. And Escher mastered these techniques of illusion in order to trick the viewer into seeing things that aren't there or could never happen in real life. This brings us to a modern movement, op art. Emerging in the mid-1900s, op art is a form of abstract art that gives the illusion of movement by the precise use of pattern and color, or in which conflicting patterns emerge and overlap. The media and general public viewed Escher as an op artist because of his work with illusion. In fact, Patrick Hughes, who created this artwork here, lists Escher on the back of these books, listing famous op artists, including Salvador Dali and Nancy Fouts. But let's see what Escher had to say about this. He said, "I am always wandering around in enigmas. There are young people who constantly come to tell me, you too are making op art. I haven't the slightest idea what that is, op art. I've been doing this work for 30 years now." And so Escher felt that his work was so much deeper and went so much further and had been there from before even op art existed. And this really brings us to relativity. The eye is immediately drawn to the Penrose triangle formed by the three main staircases. Escher has named this piece Relativity. Let's take a look at what the Oxford Dictionary defines relativity as. Relativity is the dependence of various physical phenomena on relative motion of the observer and the observed objects, especially regarding the nature and behavior of light, space, time, and gravity. Notice how light is streaming in from all different directions, yet the sun is actually coming through the center of the image right here. This image has no sense of space or direction because everywhere is up and down simultaneously. Notice that there are three sources of gravity in this image, and thus three separate worlds intersecting. On the bottom right, we have a couple having dinner, and they're pulled towards the ground from a source of gravity coming from the left. On the top left, we have a couple walking in a park-like area, and they're pulled down obliquely towards the right. And there are other sources of gravity in this image. Those are just the two sort of most easily identifiable ones. When Escher made this print, he was transitioning from a period of wartime isolation to a period of more global recognition, featuring in both Time and Life magazines in the early 1950s. Escher was at the period when he was expanding his practice in the most productive years of his life. However, relativity is slightly wider than A4 and slightly shorter than A4, forming a small square. Escher did not need his masterpiece to be huge. He already knew his own ability and what he wanted to portray on a relatively small piece of paper. All the people in this print are indistinguishable from each other, since there are no faces and no form variations. Thus, this print is showing humanity as a whole, rather than individuality. Everyone in this image could be anyone. The who is not important. Escher originally studied architecture in 1919, but he's no longer creating buildings for people to inhabit. He's now following the same thought process, but distorting it into new creations to put onto 2D paper. In Relativity, Escher has created his own world for us to enjoy. Each person is blissfully ignorant of the other worlds and planes around them. Walls transform into ceilings and floors depending on who is using them. This is Escher's description of this print. He said, "It is impossible for the inhabitants of different worlds to walk or sit or stand on the same floor because they have different conceptions of what is horizontal and what is vertical. Yet they may well share the use of the same staircase." On the top staircase illustrated here, two people are moving side by side and in the same direction, and yet one of them is going downstairs and the other upstairs. Contact between them is out of the question because they live in different worlds and therefore can have no knowledge of each other's existence. In my opinion, these two people represent how we often live so close to people whom we know nothing about and remain oblivious to their lives and experiences. These figures are not bothered by their bizarre gravity-defying surroundings. They live within it comfortably, which can be interpreted as how humans adapt to or ignore absurdity in their own lives. The people in this print are only interested in the happenings in their own gravitational, social, or mental bubble, oblivious to the others surrounding them. In Tower of Babel, the people were separated by language boundaries created by an outside force. But now, 25 years later, Escher has created a print where the people are separated by their own ignorance. My interpretation of this work is that it shows how society is fragmented into different worlds, heedless of each other. It also shows humanity's constant attempt to push beyond all previous boundaries. Escher said that only those who attempt the absurd will achieve the impossible. I'm going to end with a quote from Escher. In my prints, I try to show that we live in a beautiful and orderly world and not in a chaos without norms as we sometimes seem to. My subjects are also often playful. I cannot help mocking all our unwavering certainties. It is, for example, great fun deliberately to confuse 2 and 3 dimensions, the plane and space, or to poke fun at gravity. Are you sure that a floor cannot also be a ceiling? Are you absolutely certain that you go up when you walk up a staircase? Thank you.